Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Putri Said from Group 9 who will present about American literature in contemporary times. We will discuss the three important points. The first is history, the second is writers, and the third is characteristic. But before continuing to the discussion points, the first I will uh, explain what is contemporary literature. So, what is contemporary literature? Contemporary means living or belonging to or occurring in the present. Uh, so, when we talk about contemporary literature, that we are talking about literature that is being written in the now about the now. But what does the now encompass? Contemporary literature is defined as literature written after World War II through the current day. While this is a vague definition, there is not a clear-cut explanation of this concept, only interpretation by scholars and academics. While there is some disagreement, most agree that contemporary literature is writing completed after 1940. When we talk about contemporary literature, and the start date of this label, we have to acknowledge World War II and the surrounding events. The horrors of the war, including bombs, ground wars, genocide, and corruption, are the pathways to this type of literature. It is from these real-life themes that we find the beginning of new period of writing. However, this doesn't mean all works will center around Holocaust or war narratives. These works aim to speak to the injustices in the world and the search for civil rights. The topics and questions that were signed during this traumatic time in world history. Okay, that was a brief explanation about contemporary literature. Go ahead, I will explain the first point in this presentation. There is history. In history section is divided into 9 parts. One post World War II prosperity, two new century and millennium, third is space exploration, four Korean War, five Vietnam War, and six Gulf War, seven WTC 9 to 11, eight Iraq War, and nine advance in technology. Okay, first post-World War prosperity. Um, Among the most respected post-war American poets are John Asbury, the key figure of the surrealistic New York School of Poetry, and his celebrated self-portrait in a convex mirror, Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, 1976. Elizabeth Bishop and her North and South Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, 1976, and Geography 3 National Book Award 1970, Richard B. Wilbur and his Taste of This World, winner of both Pulitzer and National Book Award for Poetry in 1957. John Berryman and his The Dream Songs Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 1964, National Book Award 1968. E.R. amongst whose collected poems 1951 to 1971 won a National Book Award in 1973, and whose long poem Gerbeck earned him another in 1993. Theodore Roth and his The White King Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 1954. James Merrill and his epic poem of communication with the dead, The Changing Light at Sandover, Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 1977. Lois Clark for The Wild Iris, Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 1993, and Faithful and 2009, National Book Award 2014, who is additionally the only living American author publishing primarily written poetry and the Nobel Prize in Literature. Uh, ne- Next to the W.S. Marine for the Care of Letters Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 1971, and The Shadow of Sirius Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 2009. Mark Strand for Lizard of One Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 1999, Robert Hess of Time and Materials, which won both Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award for Poetry in 2008 and 2007 respectively, and Ritadov for Thomas and Bola Pulitzer Prize for Poetry 1987. In addition, in the same period, at the confessional, whose origin is often traced to the publication in 1959 of Robert Lowell's Life Studies, and both schools of poetry enjoy popular and academic success, producing such widely anthologized voices as Allen Ginsberg, Charles Bukowski, Jerry Snyder, and Sexton and Sylvia Plath among many others. Okay, next, the second, two, new century and millennium. At the beginning of the 20th century, American novelists were expanding fiction to encompass both high and low life and sometimes connected to the naturalist school of realism. In her stories and novels, Edith Wharton, 1862 to 1937, scrutinized the upper class Eastern Seaboard society in which she had grown up. One of her finest books, The Age of Innocence, 1920, centers on a man who chose to marry a conventional, socially acceptable woman rather than a fascinating outsider. A social issue and the power corporation was the central concern of some writers at this time. Upton Sinclair, most famous for his muckraking novel The Jungle, 1906, advocate socialism. Other political writers of the period include Edwin, Edwin Markham and William Falk Moody. Journalistic critics, including Ida M. Tarbell and Lincoln Stevens, were labeled the muckrakers. The muckrakers. Henry Brooks Adams' literate autobiography, the Education of Henry Adams, uh, 1907, also depicts a singing description of the education system and modern life. Race was a common issue as well as seen in the work Pauline Hopkins, who published five influential works. Similarly, Suisin Far wrote about Chinese American experience, and Maria Cristina Mena wrote about Mexican American experience. Prominent among my Western and Western American writers were Willie Carter and Willie Stroegner, both of whom had a major opus had largely in the regions. Okay, uh, three, space exploration. Humans have always looked at the events and wonder about the nature of the object seen in the next sky. In the next sky, with the development of rockets and the advance in electronics and other technologies in the 20th century, it became possible to send machines and animals and then people above Earth atmosphere in outer space. Well before technologies made this achievement, people, however, space exploration had already captured the minds of many people, not only aircraft pilots and scientists, but also writers and artists. The stronghold that space travel has always had on the imagination may well explain why professional astronauts and lay people like consent and their great peril In the words of Tom Wolfe in the Reichstag, and lay people like consent at their great peril. In the words of Tom Wolfe in the Reichstag, 1979, to shit to sit on top of an enormous Roman candle, such as Redstone, Atlas, Titan, or Saturn rocket, and wait for someone to light the fuse. It perhaps also explains why space exploration has become a common enduring theme in literature and art. Eccentricities or speculative fiction um, in books and more recently in films make clear one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind was taken by the human spider many times and in many ways before Neil Armstrong stamped humankind's first footprint on the moon. Okay, for the next explanation will be present by my friend. For me, enough. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Next is about the Korean War. The Korean War, the conflict between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, now known as North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, now known as South Korea, which caused the deaths of at least 2.5 million people. In June 1950, the war acquired international proportion when North Korea attacked the South, facilitated by the Soviet Union. The United Nations, with the United States as the main participant, joined the war on the side of South Korea, and the People's Republic of China came to the aid of North Korea. After more than a million battle casualties had been suffered on both sides, the fighting ended in July 1953, with Korea still divided into hostile nations. Negotiation in 1954 resulted in no further agreement, and the front line has been accepted ever since as the de facto boundary between North and South Korea. And from a Cold War literary and cultural studies perspective, the Korean War is a special moment in U.S. cultural history. First, this essay proposes that there are two broad periods of Korea War literature. The first phase is a work written in the 1950th century and early 1960th century, generally by white, male Americans who fought in the war, reported on the war, or had some other ties to the U.S. military. And the second press marked by Richard Richard A. James, the matron but not gaining traction until the 1980th century and the 1990th century. Is work generally written by first or second generation Korean American who either experience the war directly or explore the cultural memory of a war that some scholars have argued is a production of the very idea of Korean Americanness. And in addition, work of this space began with the premise that the U.S. framing of the Korean War is damaging, and as such is marked by meta-arguments with a Cold War rhetorical frame that shift the meaning of the war away from U.S. claims about it. And the category of Korean War literature changed how we understand Cold War literature, and therefore post 1945 45 American Literature and Culture. Next, I would like to explain about Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a long conflict in Southeast Asia. It began in 1954 after the country divided into two parts, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam sought to bring the country back together under communism political and economic structure, and South Vietnam folk tried to prevent this. And although the United States aided South Vietnam, North Vietnam ultimately won the war in 1975. Then North Vietnam and South Vietnam united into one country, which was called Vietnam, and became a communist state. Vietnam War literature is a prolific canon of literature that consists primarily of works by American authors, but it is global in scope in its inclusion of texts from writers of other nationalities such as Australia, French, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. The war's literature first immigrated in the 1950th century during the Cold War, when Americans were serving as advisors to the French and Vietnamese in literary works such as Graham Greene's The Quiet American, a British novel, and William G. Many Vietnam War texts share the cultural necessity to bear witness and to tell writers diverse war stories such as the medical profession, clerical works, and the entertainment industry. And for the next is the Gulf War. The Gulf War that occurred in 1990 was a long and endless war in the Middle East. The Gulf War was sparked by Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990 by Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. The initial fight to drive Iraqi troops out of Kuwait began on 17 January 1991 with an aerial and naval bombardment that lasted 5 weeks. On the 24th of February, a ground assault was launched. The coalition force will liberate Kuwait and cross into Iraqi territory, won a resounding triumph. After 100 hours on the ground, the coalition called a halt to its progress and established a truce. Aerial and ground warfare were limited to Iraq, Kuwait, and territories bordering Saudi Arabia. Scud missiles were launched by Iraq against Israel and coalition targets in Saudi Arabia.
While repeating the common catchphrase of the majority of studies on literary production after 911, the powerful opening sentence of After the Fall also signaled the book's insightful differentiation and shift of focus from previous attempts at addressing the subject and immediately bring to the fore. For Gray, that's mostly at stake in the aftermath of the attack language. In fact, the author resists reproducing the rhetoric and ineffable trauma that prevail in most such studies and from lingering on the haunting absence of meaning that results from the unprecedented nature of the attack. Instead, he views 911 under the spectrum of the fall, a recurrent tendency in American writing to identify crisis as descent from innocence to experience. To this effect, Gray traced the manifestation of mounting and melancholy intrinsic to American society in an instance of crisis as well as the specificities of post-911 American culture and suggests that the new element consists of the invalidation of language. Iraqi literature is and has been deeply marked by Iraq political history. In the late 1970s, a period of economic upturn. Prominent writers in Iraq were provided with an apartment and car by Saddam Hussein's government and were guaranteed at least one publication in a year. In exchange, literature was expected to express an galvanized support for the ruling Ba'ath Party. According to Najim Wali, during this period, even those who chose to quit writing saw themselves forced to write something that didn't reel the detector, because even silence was considered a crime. From the late 1980s onwards, Iraqi exile literature developed with readers whose rejection of dominant ideology and resistance to the wars in Iraq compelled them to formulate a brutally raw realism characterized by a shocking sense of modernity. Advances in science and technology in Western countries rapidly intensified at the start of the 19th century and brought about a sense of unprecedented progress. The devastation of World War I and the Great Depression also caused suffering in Europe and the United States. This contradictory impulse can be found swirling within the modernism, a movement in the art defined first and foremost as a radical break from the past. But this break was often an act of discretion, and it caused a loss of faith in traditional structure and beliefs. Despite this contradictory impulse, the modernist period proved to be one of the richest and most productive in American literature.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So I will talk about the writer about in the contemporary period. First is Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller is considered one of the greatest American playwrights of the 20th century. His best-known plays include All My Sons, The Crucible, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Death of a Salesman. Miller's prolific writing career spans a period of over 60 years. Miller's plays generally address social issues and center around an individual in a social dilemma or an individual at the mercy of society. The second is Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison was a Nobel Prize and Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, editor, and professor. Her novels are known for their epic themes, exquisite language, and richly detailed African American characters who are central to their narratives. Among her best known novels are The Bluest Eye, Sula, Song of Solomon, Beloved, Chess, Love and Mercy. So Morrison earned a plethora of book awards, accolades, and honorary degrees, also receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012. The 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 third is Sylvia Plath. So Sylvia Plath was an American poet, novelist, and short story writer. She is credited with advancing the genre of conventional poetry and is best known for two of her published collections, The Colossus and Other Poems, 1960, and Ariel, 1965, as well as The Bell Jar, a semi-autobiographical novel published shortly before her death in 1963. And the fourth is Jeremy David Salinger. Jeremy David Salinger was an American writer best known for his 1951 novel The Catcher in the Rye. Before its publication, Salinger published several short stories in Story magazine and served in World War II. In uh, in 90, in 1948, his critically acclaimed story A Perfect Day for Banana Fish appeared in The New Yorker, which published much of his later work. I think that's enough for me, and my friends will be continue.
Six is beat poets, a national group of poets who emerged from San Francisco literary counterculture in the 1915. Its ranks included Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Gregory Corso, and Gary Cinder. Poet and essayist Kenneth Trexford influenced the development of beat aesthetic, which rejected academic formalism and materialism and conformity of the American middle class. Beat poetry is a largely American middle class. Beat poetry is largely free verse, often surrealistic and influenced by the cadence of jazz, as well be Zen and Native American spiritually Brosmore beat poets. Uh, Number 6 is Maya Angelou, and seven is Alice Walker. And the characteristic about is one is mix of fantasy and without non-fiction. Number 2 is media culture interrupts values. Number 3 is narrative. 4 is anti-heroes. 5 is emotion provoking, and next is humorous irony. Next, storytelling. Next is individual isolation, and the last one is social issue. I think is enough, and thank you.